Let's get cruising. So today is very conversational. One of the things that we've touched on a couple times over our time through this cohort has been workforce and how we're hiring. And so we'll spend a good chunk of our conversation on that today. But before we get there, I want to check in on the last exercise that you all kicked off. I believe that was around large egos. Is that right? Large egos. We got a nod and like half a smile. Anya, there's a very noticeable lack of a response on your face right now. I'm not calling you out. I'm just putting words to that. You're like, yep, large egos, as I talk to these two Muppets. Yeah. So how's that exercise progressing, and what are you kind of identifying around large egos and how to wrangle them?
Hey, so what I'd say for our group, our cohort, was we found a lot of similarities between how we manage these egos. And so we didn't really separate out strategies for those characteristics that were good or bad. We just developed strategies overall because we can use the strategies broadly across all of the categories that we identified as good or bad categories. And so that's kind of the way we structured our response back to Megan, was more of our classification of how we categorized those items, but broad set of coaching strategies. Well, a lot of those strategies were related to coaching, but broad set of strategies that could be applicable to either, but we're consistent amongst all.
I like that. Thank you, Kevin. Anyone else on wrangling large egos? Actually, I see a smile. Anything to throw in there? You're on camera, right? You can't just smile and I not see it.
Sorry. Bob is our resident spokesman.
Okay.
No, I was joking. No.
Oh, all right, Bob. I think you've been put on the spot, my friend. Anything to throw in the mix?
All right, I will jump in here. And I will preface it by saying when we met and we discussed this subject, I was the only white male in the group, and we went over these checklists of items of what was brought out last time about ego. And the only reason I call out the fact that I was the only white male is that then the reaction to that, I'm proud to say, is the rest of the group was, I think, a little more vocal than I was, and said, we're just not going to, how do I phrase this? We think that just because some people say these are characteristics, that we find ego in everybody, and that we don't want to paint a picture of a certain category of person. Like one of the things listed, and I'm not discounting anyone's experience, but khakis. Okay, well, I don't know where this bias against khakis come from, but I have been known to wear a pair every now and then, but so had everyone else on the call. So I don't think there was certain things about khakis, but I think that what we kind of took out of that was we're allowing ourselves sometimes to be distracted to how something is packaged, right? What does it look like when it comes at us? How is it packaged with our eyes? And really, as leaders, I think we've got to train ourselves to say, you need to kind of not think about what the package is and think about getting to the heart of the person and how do you interact with that person and how do you lead going forward. I think that's kind of where we got. And if the other three that were on the call want to jump in and say I'm crazy, jump on it.
You got strong khaki vibes, Bob. I like that about you.
Oh.
No, that's real. That's that first impression or impression of a person, whether it's the first one or not, how we perceive that person well before we get into conversation is real. I think we've talked about biases we hold and what that means for how we engage with a person. But sounds like we're saying, and the Ace paraphrase version there is, we've got to check our bias so we can make some progress with the individual. And that is not always easy, but requisite to be a good leader. Make space for people to meet us on their terms, on their turf, and the way they exist in the world. I like that. Anyone want to add from Bob's call? Anybody want to call him crazy first? He's given you that opportunity, or care to elaborate on anything he just shared?
I would say no, Bob is not crazy. And it was kind of interesting to watch our group because we started realizing that list that we were given, there was a lot of biases in that list. And so then we wanted to change the list afterwards. The other thing was we really talked about, when you say managing egos, a lot of people we were talking about, is that really trying to change that other person, and realizing that we can't change someone else, that we really have to change the way we respond to it and recognize our own reactions or our own unconscious bias or conscious bias to try to be better leaders. And then also trying to establish a relationship with that person to maybe understand where they're coming from, or get their perspective rather than judging them.
Yeah. Can I jump in as the other white male on this call and share? No.
You asked. No, actually, you ought to jump in, but I'm just going to capture a thread of the conversation we had with the state government leaders about beards and tattoos. And we'll pull that at some point, because I think that leads into the workforce conversation and how we hire and shifting our perceptions or perspective. So go ahead, jump in. But
So I was just going to share, we were with the state of South Carolina a couple of weeks ago with the governor's cabinet, and we were running a similar program to TLDP with the state of South Carolina. And we ran this exercise around in groups and out groups, which we've touched on, but we put tape on the floor, and we had everybody stand in the center, and there were two lines in this big room that we were in. And the first one we did was whether you're left-handed or right-handed, move each side of the tape. And the in-group was right-handed and the out-group was left-handed. Is anybody left-handed in our group? Raise your left hand if you're left-handed. Everybody's right-handed. Interesting. Okay. So
Kevin, did you come back on to not raise your hand?
Is that so what was interesting about that was the left-handers. So it was immediately something that you couldn't see on the outside, which I thought was interesting. It wasn't age, it wasn't gender, it wasn't race or ethnicity. It was sort of whether you're left-handed or right. But the left-handers spoke very passionately about living in a world that's designed for right-handed people. And I love that it was coincidence that we did that one first, but I really like that we did that one first, because it was a very easy way to explain that what Bob and I experience is we just experience a world that is designed for us. Ashley talked about rain head showers in hotel bathrooms. And if you're a Black woman with long hair, rain head showers are an absolute nightmare, and clearly hotel rooms are not designed for Black women, and sort of talked about that. And but one of the things that I'm starting to realize, which potentially Bob is as well, is it's less to do with the labels or the stereotypes or whether we have large egos or we don't as individuals, but just the world is built for us. The world, it just is. Historically, it's set that way. And when you live in a world that's built for you, you don't notice any friction because there's very little friction.
Right.
It's just and I experienced this with you because we travel together way too much. I
don't know where you're going with this.
I get to see the world through a Black man's eyes, indirectly, right? Largely from behind you. And I get to see, I don't get to see the world through the eyes of a woman. Bob, we're doing that thing. See, we're both talking a lot in this meeting. But so it's that, I think that's an interesting framework around sort of the structures. Yes, well, you're facilitating.
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Bob, you raised your hand.
Yeah, so let me challenge you a little bit.
Go for it.
Regardless of how the idea is packaged, I'm going to go back to the visual or the characteristics we know about the person. That doesn't validate or invalidate their worth or the idea. So I think we have to be real careful of that we don't say, there is no doubt in your presentation of in-groups and out-groups. Sure. I mean, I'm not questioning that at all. But if, let's say we do that in a group and we say these members of this big group are the in-group and these members are the out-group, are we subconsciously saying to the whole that we have to bias toward what we have categorized as the out-group, I think we have to be real careful there. I think what we have to concentrate is the merit of the one giving the issue, the idea, the efforts put forth by the one in the group, regardless of what category they either place themselves in or we as leaders place them in. I think we have to be real careful there. That we're not discounting their personal experience, not discounting what they've been through, not discounting the realities of life, but that we're really focusing on what they're bringing or the idea that's being debated or things like that. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, first, thank you, right? Like, this is the type of, I think, dialogue that is worthwhile. Like, this is the hard stuff to wrestle through at times. I'll latch on to one of the words that, Bob, you happen to use, but we use often, which is merit. And we talk about merit as if this objective measure of worth, right? Does this have merit or does it not? And merit is subjective. It's often through the lens or the worldview of the folks in charge, or given a hierarchy or a power dynamic. It's often seen as the way that we ought to do a thing. I'll use a really good example that Ashley from our team sent Scott and I a podcast yesterday. And they were talking about EG readers, or the kind of EG nodes that you put on your head as one has a seizure. And they were talking about the disparity, particularly in race, when it comes to being able to get EG leads attached to someone's scalp. And the one of the barriers there being particularly Black folks' hair and your ability to get to the scalp given their hair. And the medical piece is probably less important. What the researchers who are working on solving this issue and finding hairstyles for Black folks to be able to get the same readings and just some equity in medicine is that as folks were presenting to journals and conferences about how we might redesign the clips that connect to an EG machine so we can get readouts from particularly communities of color, it was the physicians and the doctors at conferences and reviewing journals that said this doesn't have as much merit as the existing infrastructure that we already have in the healthcare community. And so what I found, my takeaway from that is, given the hierarchy and the foundation upon which we've built most of our systems, the folks who end up in the out group most often along gender lines, along sexual orientation, along skin color, along ability, those folks end up in the out group, and therefore their suggestions aren't seen as having as much merit. And so, like, yeah, we can have the conversation around merit. We have to adjust for bias. And importantly, we have to factor that in as we're figuring out how much space we create and some of the biases we might hold that preclude us even hearing their suggestion in the first place. That's a long way of saying yes to merit, with a massive caveat that we have to know what our biases are and why someone might end up in the out group so we can appropriately engage and get the value of their ideas when they present them. So that's a big, long thing, but that's what I'm thinking about right now.
So you sure in the example that they weren't saying that it'd be a lot easier to hook Scott up than it would be to hook you up, eh?
Yeah, and secondarily, I mean, to that end, they were saying, hey, you ought to shave Ace's head in order to get this EG machine on, right? And so then we start talking about what is professional hair, for instance, and that my natural hair might not be as professional as Scott's full bald. And so, like, all of these things start to ripple into a social sphere that feels like it ought to be separated from professionalism, but it's not, because somebody says that this hair isn't professional. And when I go into a healthcare environment, I'm either getting subpar healthcare or somebody is taking my hair from me, which is really important to me in a way that Scott can't even connect to because he doesn't have hair. Yeah.
When it's just rounding out this wrangling egos thing, can I talk as a brutal negotiator here? So Ace is a mediator, so we'll always look to build bridges. I'm a negotiator. I get hired to get the result for clients. And so putting a completely brutalist lens on that, One of the reasons I think that these structures are important with regard to wrangling egos is a structural one, in that if you delve into military theory or negotiation theory, the most emotionally violent people are people who feel threatened. It's a very normal thing. When you think of people who feel threatened, you don't think of white males. You think of outgroups. Now, but that's not how this plays out. Is that the category that I'm in, that Kevin's in, that Bob's in, regardless of our personal experiences, we might have had the most derelict, abusive backgrounds as individuals, but on a macro level, our category of person on a relative basis is having our opportunities chipped away at. On a relative basis, not on an absolute basis. On an absolute basis, I still have more opportunity in the world. Very measurable by economists, like the way that social structures have worked, I have more opportunity than almost everybody on this call. But relative to what people before me had, it's getting less and less, because we're getting more equality and meritocracy and equity running through the system. So when you are dealing not with top leaders, I'm not worried about the men who are at the top of their game, or the women who are at the top of the game, or those people who might be in a more socially in group being at the top of their game, because you're very comfortable with it. Bob's happy to have this conversation. Kevin's happy to have this conversation. I'm talking about the person who is genuinely suffering imposter syndrome, that is there because there has been less friction for them getting to the position, and are now faced with a much more diverse workforce, a much more aggressively diverse workforce that mathematically feels more threatened. And when we're threatened, we lash out. So it's not about a profiling around a demographic and whether we're all being treated equally or not. I'm just putting my negotiator helmet on and saying, structurally, the category of people, whether it's reasonable or not, are threatened and therefore tend to lash out. And maybe, this word wrangling egos, because ego can be good. You can have healthy ego and unhealthy ego. But, as Sun Tzu taught us 10,000 years ago, never fight an enemy with their back against the wall. One of the things you want to find out is, look, I feel very comfortable in my Korean role, but I know many other people who are genuinely suffering imposter and are afraid of being caught out. And there's nothing more threatening than a woman showing up or a person of color showing up and doing that. And so we want you living in this sort of realistic structural world rather than, and so Bob, completely to your point, know the individual and know those. And I think this is an and rather than a but, and observe what's happening structurally. And we can cheer it on, but also recognize that there are those people who are threatened. And I've always struggled with this because most HR departments will say, when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, you can't say it's a zero-sum game. It is a zero-sum game. There are only so many opportunities in the world. There are relative trade-offs. There are right reasons for doing it. But understanding that, we want to make you more powerful as we go through. Ace is writing a message on our encrypted messaging system, which may be saying, will you stop talking right now? So I'm just going to read that.
No, I wasn't. I was getting Vera to update the Slido that we're about to use based on something that just came up in this conversation.
All right.
So any other notes on wrangling egos and either how we think about those things really intentionally, or we step back a little bit and say everybody's an individual? Anything to kind of wrap this conversation up, and we'll jump into workforce and hiring and all that good stuff. Any observations? Okay. Cool. I love it. Hi, April. Hi, Rebecca. Saw you all jump on. I think I saw Anne on as well. Danny's here. Debbie, rather. Love it. Okay. All right. Let's keep cruising. So I want to shift conversation over to workforce. Again, this has come up in some sidebar conversations we've had. It's come up in our main general NASCA session. So Kevin, I think you certainly were tuned in. Debbie, I think you were on one of those when we were in Scottsdale. And so it seems, my observation is across state government, we are having conversations about how we hire, how we retain talent, how we make their lives make more sense, how we recalibrate coming out of a pandemic, perhaps, and now resetting expectations on what work from home means, what that looks like, if we actually need to come back to the office, if butts in seats is the thing that makes state government look like it's functioning. That is not my words that I heard from one of the governors we were chatting with. All of those pieces, April, I see a nod from you. So I want to jump into that conversation. Let's pop over to slide.
I'm nervous already because we fight about this all the time.
Yeah, but the best part is I'm right. So,
Embracing diverse opinions.
You'll see
We
the slide
we
question of the
completely
bias
disagree on
question
this
second.
subject.
all right, let me share my screen and pull up Slido. Everybody have their phones or browsers up. And I'll get that Slido up to you. Oh, you sent me a link. I've got it.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, I got it.
You're still on screen share.
I'm not on screen share yet.
No, okay.
No, it's just our screen
All
share.
right. All right, I'll mind my own business. There, there on screen share.
There we go.
We
Is that up?
Yeah, you're not at the logged in. Excuse us while we have a technical issue over here.
Apparently, I don't know
All right,
how to use my
go to
computer.
Slido and log in. Are you logged in? Will you share screen?
Thanks, V.
Wrangling egos. This is what happens when the boss tries to run tech. So letting the person who's the expert.
I'm the reason we don't have nice things, is what you're hearing. Which is probably fair, given most of you who have met me. So V is going to share her screen, and we're going to jump to Slido. But you can head to slido.com/NASCA TLDP.
There you go. Look at that. See how smoothly that happened.
You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to do that. Okay, when
Can
it
we
comes to
participate in
workforce, we can.
All right.
When it comes to workforce, what are your biggest concerns is where I'd like to start.
Would you say, Ace, biggest what?
Biggest concern when it comes to workforce,
Oh, I see that.
talent, space, hiring, retention. Yep, retention, recruitment.
Hey V, on the back end, are you able to get rid of the word limitation, the character limitation? You may not be able to do it while it's open. And we can do more than one response.
You can enter as many responses as you'd like.
Look at that. You did fix it.
Mm. Okay.
That's interesting how broad this is,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah. I'm also thinking of things you will assume is me, and it's not me.
I make zero
No, it's
assumptions.
because I did. Yeah,
Okay.
this has also become a bit of trench warfare, hasn't it? This subject.
You wrote Managing the Paradox, didn't you?
I didn't.
No,
No,
what?
I didn't. I didn't write Managing the
Yes.
Paradox, which I assumed you'd write, and I didn't
I
write
don't
Lack
believe
of
that.
Collaboration in the Remote, which I presumed you would presume I would have written.
I do presume you wrote that. I think you're just lying to me.
No, I didn't.
Okay. All right. Let's jump in. Retention, I think, wins. Retention wins. Hey, V. Let's leave this up for a second.
Yeah.
Let's talk about retention for a second. What's on top of mind? The large, so we did a word cloud. The large blue means the largest number of folks wrote that word, which is why it's the largest. So let's talk about it. What's on your mind? What's giving you heartache? What's keeping you up at night around retention right now? Anyone's game.
Yeah, I'll speak on my behalf.
Yeah.
Because I turned over statistically in a year and a half, 46% of my financial workforce.
Mm.
And so I say, as I look at some of my state of Colorado folks who I know stole my employees.
Poaching by other organizations is captive. Thank you, Kevin.
That it is. I say that as I stole one of my fellow agency's controllers. So I'm guilty of that too. I think it's just the broader perspective of, and not all retention issues are bad, right? I'm very fond of telling my employees we don't run a hostage program, but watching talent go out the door because we don't have in state government the ability to be agile with our workforce for those performers who are good and we want to retain. So the only way for them to advance is to go somewhere else, right? Not a good or a bad thing. It's just the way state government works because we don't have that flexibility that maybe the private sector does. But when we do that, we lose time and effort in the development of our culture. We lose brain drains on there. I saw that. We lose continuity. And I know many of my fellow colleagues on this class and other state agencies, right? We run on razor thin margins. We don't have that quality of quantity out there. And so, you know, when a senior accountant or a program manager leaves and we don't have continuity or succession of command or leadership type planning in place, and we haven't been intentionally developing, we go through these sine waves of competence, if you will, in terms of our customer support and how we provide services. And so we've tried to spend a lot of time and energy in planning for resilience, knowing that we started this with COVID, right? Because honestly, at the start of COVID, my controller was 65. And I was quite concerned about the health and welfare of some of my workforce, just being a little bit older in the demographic phase, and how we were going to work through periods of time where we had key people who were out with a pretty serious illness. So that's kind of my thought on retention. Is it's a very multifaceted issue, but you know, it's going to happen in state government one way or the other, just because we're not as agile as the private sector in terms of those good performers that want to move up, because that next up opportunity, there is no, I'm it, right? For my organization, right? There's not another position for me unless I wanted to do something else in a different organization. So, you know, I've got lots of one-offs, and I don't have a good way to develop those.
Yeah. Okay. Kevin, appreciate that. Let's I'm going to capture that for a second, and then we'll kind of dig on a couple of things. Debbie, I see your hand up. What are you thinking?
Sure. I just wanted to sort of build on that. For me, a lot of these other comments sort of feed into retention. Like, it's hard to compete with salaries. The unemployment rate is really low. And so employees have a choice of where to work. And so, you know, when we are trying to manage remote and hybrid, and perhaps we don't have it right quite yet, it's hard to have that. What am I trying to say? Employees will often feel more loyal or stay with their employer if they have a strong connection to their employer. And I feel like, at least in our situation right now, we are feeling a little disconnected from our employees with the amount of remote work we have, but we also don't want to pull back on it too hard, because they may leave and want to go somewhere else where they would still have the flexibility. And so it's kind of a tricky balance that we're trying to figure out in terms of retention.
Yeah, absolutely. Debbie, thank you. Out of curiosity, managing the paradox, whoever wrote that, was that capturing a bit of what Debbie just shared? You know, if I pull back on some of the privileges folks feel like they have, I'm going to lose them to other places, but I need them here to build culture and communicate better and collaborate. Like, is that the paradox we're talking about? I'm putting somebody on the spot. Feel free to disregard.
Ace, that's me. I
Okay.
wrote that, and absolutely, I think in looking at just a number of these different kind of characteristics and things that we're thinking about as we solve for one issue, you know, it opens the door to a number of other issues. And so I think one of the greatest challenges is really complexifying the conversation at multiple levels of the organization and just allowing for just contradiction when we're asking for folks to come back to the office a little bit more without kind of setting a floor or some sort of policy. And we're saying, you know, what we're seeing, it's really hard to, you know, quantify, but we can qualify it, is that people really enjoy spending time together. We can make decisions quicker in spaces together when we're all kind of in the same room. It's just kind of the fabric of being in space together, breaking bread, whatever the case might be, is really important. And when people are brought to the office and they do that and they experience that, it's really important. Yet, when talking about productivity for some folks that just have a job that has demands where they were just more successful through COVID and being in kind of the virtual space, they're then having to go back and, you know, having to do work late at night, early morning, and it's the contradiction of then burnout, right? So there's just not one way of solving for some of these complex issues. And so to have that conversation with nuance across organizations and just allowing for just the conversation to happen, I think is probably the hardest piece. And this goes for retention, for all sorts of things that are on the page here.
Nuance, there's a word. So Scott, I've just realized we recorded our podcast yesterday. It came out today. Yeah. And I'm realizing that, Scott, you just listened to Anya and took all of the things she talked about and put it in the podcast yesterday. So he didn't cite you for any of those points, and I'm going to hold him to that next
we were one brain yesterday. Like I
certainly not unique.
I struggle with this so much with our team. I struggle with it with clients and client teams. And there is, what I love what you're doing, Anya, is you're like carrying that contradiction that sits between treating everybody the same and those people who have more routine jobs that are clearly evidentially more productive in a quiet space. It turns out that quiet space can be home, we can save the commute. And there are those that are in what I call more creative or collaborative or political spaces where just getting in the room, we're doing it moments before we went live, there's 4 of us working out a path forward, that I have trouble imagining. And I don't think we've come close to an answer on this other than, well,
can you imagine scheduling that meeting or hopping on a call to have the organic conversation that we just had? And we worked through 4 topics. Yeah. We were supposed to get together for 10 minutes before this call. Yeah, Scott and I were here on the desk at the studio. 10-minute conversation turned into probably a 20-minute conversation, but we covered 4 or 5 things, and like decisions were made, and we've all gone back out. We started this. Perry and V are running the session, but also thinking about some of the to-dos that they just got from our meeting. Like, that's hard to replicate virtually. So just acknowledging that, like, yeah, we cut down on commute and people get really great work done at home, but also we lose this, and the inverse is true. Just owning that there is tension and it requires nuance to get to an optimal decision, because we can't get to a perfect decision on most of the things that I'm seeing up as a concern here. Yeah. As we talk about, we're going to bottom line leadership in Savannah. That's our next topic in person. Part of what we'll do is capture some of the things we don't touch on in our next 20 minutes or so, and just make sure that's rolled into session, because these are big things, particularly as we talk about influencing your organization. that are going to be, I
They
think,
are
important.
We're
points.
also going to talk about perfect versus optimal decisions. And I think this is one where optimal decisions really kick in.
Mhm.
That's linked to how you communicate with your organization, because there just isn't a right answer to this.
Yeah.
Like there are direct contradictions. And so each state, each Commonwealth, and each agency and department, depending upon the amount of freedom that they have, is going to have to make their own decision.
Mhm.
And whether that's in the state of Washington, the state of Tennessee, the state of Colorado, this is going to come from the governor down. And I know we're here in the capital of Virginia, and the governor here pretty much came out and said, it was interesting. I think he was speaking to a more liberal audience than his stance in saying, look, you believe in urban centers and thriving local communities and local businesses. If you want a capital city, you've got to come to work. Like, because you have to go to those coffee shops and you have to go to those restaurants and you have to go to that takeout stand. And I totally relate to it. On the other hand, we've dealt with Governor Cox's team in Utah, and Governor Cox is very clear. Like, this is an opportunity for rural employment. This is a way for us not to lose our children from our small towns across the state. Make it work.
Yeah, I think his direct quote was the rural Utah's greatest export is its children. That's how he kind of framed it. But it's like those folks want to stay in their communities, close to family. Some of them do, right? In their communities.
That's a
close
terrible
to
headline.
Yeah.
The greatest export is young adults, not their children. The children are at home, safe and sound with their families, go to school and get grown education.
But we know
it's sort of two governors with a similar outlook on the world coming up with two very different solutions.
Yep.
And I think that illustrates like just how complex this is.
Yeah. Can we talk about salary for a second? I know we've touched on it briefly, but that seems, I think of my dad runs natural resources for the U.S. Virgin Islands, or rather he's moved over. He kind of works through various agencies, but has moved over to the EPA equivalent for USVI. And he's like, look, I need to hire PhD level folks who know the economy and who know geography, and like I need highly technical folks, and I would rather hire one of them versus three people at the salary band that I have allotted. And so he's constantly struggling with, I would rather take two positions and put those salaries together to hire one person who can move things forward in my agency than make those two suboptimal hires. How do I wrestle with that? I'd imagine that's part of the salary conversation. Anybody want to jump on that who threw salary in the mix or who is thinking about this regularly?
So I'll chime in. In 2 years, I've had 50% turnover, which is a little worse than Kevin had.
Kevin, you lose.
And a lot of that's due to a lot of organizational changes. Regulations changed, laws changed. People used to work for different agencies, had to come work for this agency. So there was a huge culture change. But the two reasons that those 50% have left were either salary or directly related to our telework benefits. There's no, like, I talk to everyone when they resign, we sit down, we have an honest, frank conversation about their decision. Most of it's salary related. The ones that weren't salary related were related to our restrictive telework policy. Those are the two reasons that people have left my organization in the last 2 years.
And April, did they go to the private sector? Do we know?
No. So I'm in procurement. So usually when you're in public procurement, like that's valuable. What happens is we're in Maryland, so we have to compete with the federal government.
Yeah.
We have to compete, with Virginia, the other local states. We have to compete with the counties, the Board of Education. So we had a staff person that left right around 6 months ago. She left here to take a different position at a Board of Education and negotiated a 20% higher salary to go do less work. Our salaries at the executive branch are about 18% lower than all of our peers in this region. We cannot compete with other government agencies, not just private. No one has left to go private. They've all left to either go to another state agency or go to a local jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
We did have one person go to a bank. So the bank is private, but he was commuting from Pennsylvania and they were forcing him to drive from central Pennsylvania to Baltimore, which was 2.5 hours each way. So drive 5 hours a day to telework from the Baltimore office to our office. And his wife's, he has a relative on his wife's side that works for a different state agency that allows 100% telework. So because our agency does not allow 100% telework, he thought he was going to be able to get it here. So after working here for, I mean, he was like a month away from his 1-year anniversary when he left. But because he saw someone else that worked for the state that had 100% telework, he assumed he would be able to get it here. Even though when we interviewed everyone, we were clear about the policy. It was still during COVID when he was hired, and we were under renovation. So he did get to 100% telework for his first 4 months. But that extra 5 hours of commuting, even twice a week, was a huge strain for him.
Mm-hmm. Question for the states represented. Does anybody have a policy that allows them to hire outside of the state? So April, you've got someone in central Pennsylvania commuting to Maryland. Of course, anybody else hire outside of the state and allow people to work from wherever they are?
If I remember from our first session, I think Oregon is exploring that. Our friends in Oregon might be able to speak to that. But
And Debbie's hands up.
yeah, the state of Colorado does not, unless you live within 30 miles of your work location. Then a prime example is you could live in Cheyenne, Wyoming, but work in Fort Collins.
Gotcha.
So,
Okay.
yeah,
Gotcha.
you have Colorado's. We are a hostage program. You got to be within the borders.
Both are and are not a hostage program. I like that. Debbie, what's the state of Oregon thinking about right now?
Yeah, we actually do allow it. We
Okay.
allow you to work from any state. The controversy that we're facing is we got ourselves into a situation where with our represented folks, if we require, our current policy states that if we require an employee to come back to Salem for any sort of training or meetings, then the state is responsible for covering those travel costs. And that gets pretty sticky. There's a lot of reasons, so I won't derail the conversation. So we are actually looking to maybe revisit that piece of the policy. I believe there's legislation maybe dropping today, as a matter of fact, that would have the state repeal that policy if it's passed. But there doesn't seem to be any real interest in limiting, once again, the ability for employees to live anywhere and work for the state of Oregon. It's mostly about this, who pays if they have to come in for training. So,
and that would model private sector. I think the private sector has largely said, yes, if you're employed, you relocate, but there will be X number of meetings a year where you're expected to be back in your home office. You will pick up after that. Yeah. So it's just adding policy to that. What role is, if you had to price the salary differential, what price differential do you think you get as for that sort of, I work civically, I work for my government, I work for my community, I work for my citizens? Is that, do you get a 5% bump relative to private sector, 10, 15? If you had to put a number on it, does anybody have an opinion, or do you have any research on what that says?
I'll just tell you the world according to Rance. I don't think, at least the sentiment in my department is, we don't have an expectation that state employees are paid more. We have an expectation that state employees are paid fairly. But what we don't do well in our agency, at least, is advertise the value of the employment through total compensation.
Right.
So the insurance, right? The para benefits, the Public Employees Retirement Association. The state's got matching contributions, right? And so hiring a bunch of 20-somethings, which is what I did straight out of college in the financial world, they're not thinking about that, right? Because they're trying to scratch out a living in Denver, Colorado, which isn't cheap. So they're looking at what gets deposited. They're not thinking, about 25, 30 years down the road when they're eligible for state retirement, and the value of the state's contribution to that para bucket, right? And so I think for us, a lot of what we're trying to do is maybe just take a step back and help educate them on the value of the total compensation versus necessarily just the dollar amount. And I know total comp doesn't pay rent and lights and gas and that kind of stuff, but that's just something that we're internally working in our arena, because we're noticing a lot more of our talent pool is either on the back end of the scale, age demographic wise, or at the lower end of the scale. That middle sector, of the bell curve, we're not really seeing a lot of those folks apply anymore because we can't compete with the dollar.
Yeah. It's almost like there should be a standard template that is mailed to every employee with their total comp and benefits, which is, some kind of graphic over the overall picture of where you are. But I agree sort of with that.
And, we talk about total comp as well. I'm done in the healthcare and benefits and insurance world. And one of the big pieces, right, that early 20-something isn't really thinking about insurance or benefits until they hit about 26, when they get kicked off of their parents' healthcare. Right. Like, and so like you could tell me all of the great things about a Benny's package when I'm 21, 22, right out of school. I don't know enough to care. And even if you give me a full education, it'd be time poorly spent, I think, because I don't actually care. Right. I'm on TRICARE on my parents' healthcare. Like, that's awesome. You can't compete with that. And then when I hit 26, it's like, oh, snap. Now I need to think about all of these things. But the retirement conversation doesn't really start making sense until I'm early, maybe mid 30s. It should make sense earlier, but like the realities of meeting people where they are and what's in there, like everybody has their own hierarchy of needs outside of roof over my head and self-actualization. Like the order of things in between those two shifts based on demographic, based on cohort, based on location. So I'd rather have more cash in pocket to pay for rent in Denver. But if I went to Helena, Montana, for instance, relatively affordable to exist there, or Richmond, Virginia, I might think about some other things like PTO or ability to commute so I can go paddleboard during the day.
Can I ask the obvious question of why you are all still in your positions? Is there what has precluded you? I'm sure you see the job market. Some of you are based in very, very frothy job markets. What are the types of things that say, no, I'm going to stay here. I'm not going to take one of those offers or apply for one of those positions?
I'll jump in.
Oh,
Nashville is a very, very aggressive market right now. The salaries are very strong. So are home prices. I'm about to list my house because of what I was told it would bring. So, so why have I stayed in government? Well, I do have a senior position, so that's good. I have been empowered to change things for the good, and I have been left alone to coach and build a team. And that culture, I really have a bond to and a love for the culture that I'd like to think I had some influence in creating. And so one of the two that I mentioned in this is harmony and what was the other one? Harmony and positive coaching time. So those are the things that I really enjoy. And I will say though that I've got some things on the horizon for the next 2 to 3 years. And then after that, I may get a little bored. and I don't do too well with being bored. I like having a lot on me and a lot of change. So what's really been, it's the empowering in the environment. It's the latitude to make positive change. It's the team that I think we've built as a group. I've got a 5 to 9% turnover rate over the last 5 years. So I'm very thankful of that. I've been very fortunate in this environment that I just don't turn over people.
Yeah.
So,
do you think there's an element of that freedom to make a difference, like that is hard, because that's very hard to put in a total comp benefits package, isn't it? Is that you are, because look, I always think we work with government and private sector. I think people always overestimate how unbureaucratic the private sector is. I actually think the private sector is large companies are just as bureaucratic as any government agency is. But what you're working on is that line of code or selling more chocolate bars or whatever is the thing, that business that you're in. I wonder if you can find a way to express like you will actually get to work on something that matters and progress it.
All right, well, I got a little comment on that, Scott. You know, I oversee, oh, did I lose you?
No, you're
Gotcha.
great. You're good.
Oh, okay. I oversee the surplus areas and the vehicle management areas and that type of thing.
Yeah.
And it's in service to the other agencies. You know, I don't, my team doesn't have the same fulfillment that maybe a human services person does that knows they help somebody in a personal crisis. You know what I mean? They don't have that experience. So it's a little bit different coaching to say you're making such a difference, right? Because sometimes they're arm's length from that difference. They're supporting the ones that really are serving the public. So it's a little bit different. So yes, the difference that I concentrate on is, were you able to succeed in what you thought was the right thing to do? Were you able to accomplish it internally? And do we get along pretty well? And so I spend a lot of effort on that. And I really have a pretty cool team that can rock and roll with just about any adversity they get hit with. And so that's what I find great enjoyment with. And I think that's what helps our turnover rate. I really do.
I love that. Hey, I don't want you to take away the emotional satisfaction you provide for the groups. On that note, given your vehicle fleet, we're looking for a Transit 350 van right now, 12-seater. So if you could find one and send one our way, we greatly appreciate it. We need
SOL, I think, is the acronym for that.
I love it. So as we wrap things, you all are going to break out along group lines, and you've got about 30 minutes, I believe, to work through the most recent tranche of work around egos. We'll talk about that in a second. But before we break, what I'd love to do is capture any of the other, this would be really helpful to talk about as we get together in Savannah from this list. So anything, I know we talked about the big ones, we'll continue on that thread. Anything else that you want to pull out? Bob just mentioned Harmony, and we just talked about coaching time a little bit. Anybody have something they want to flag that, hey, this would be really helpful to dig into a little bit more as we get together in Savannah?
just recognizing we have put together some content to promote to other attendees, but we haven't actually described. So the main focus in Savannah is, how do we develop strategy separate from the strategic plan? So how do we take a ground up view of the assets that we have, and how do we reinvent them that's fit for purpose for today? We are going to be working through optimal decision making that we talked about. We're also going to talk a little bit about decision fatigue. We're going to do more than talk about it. We're going to work through it. Decision fatigue and the 6 types of fatigue. Not just, we tend to say we're tired, but we're actually going to get into the science of the types of fatigue and what we can do about it. We're going to be borrowing that research from a member of our team who's a professor of medicine at Virginia Commonwealth University, and we'll be distributing some books on that. Then we will be moving on to how to influence our organization, narrative structures for storytelling. So if one thinks the Gutenberg prior to that, we didn't have repeatable data, repeatable information, and we communicated through stories. Human society is still configured to communicate through stories, but we tend to do it by bullet points on a PowerPoint slide. And so we'll talk about how you can take those bullet points, put them in a narrative structure, and it'll have more impact. We'll then talk about creating culture through 3 concepts: symbols, artifacts, and rituals. Symbols are indicators of behaviors. Artifacts are physical representations of them. And rituals are the things that we do that reinforce particular behaviors. And then finally, we will, I'm losing my mind. What was we talk about? Oh, communicating across boundaries. So how do we communicate across different groups, particularly as it relates to talent attraction? And maybe we finish here, which is back to your state troopers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we had a, I think, really, really good, productive conversation around the biases that we hold that might preclude either A, making a hire, bringing somebody into our workforce or our team, and B, hearing their ideas. So kind of where we started the conversation. And so we were chatting with the head of state police force, the state police force. And the comment was, we're having a ton of trouble hiring can't find qualified candidates to step into the state PD force. And part of that is that we don't allow tattoos or facial hair. And so, my question was, and you'll have this Slido question right before you break out. But my question was, what bias do we hold that precludes our ability to make a hire? And he said, I just don't think it's perfect.
Interesting. It was really fun. Sat right next to him was the head of the National Guard. And we turned around to the general and said, General, do you have an honorable crew? He gave me a dirty look. He said, yes, I have an honorable crew. So how many don't have tattoos? It was like, oh God, all of them have tattoos. And it was interesting because we sort of associated and the head of state police was sitting next to him and they get along really well. I was like, oh yeah, that sort of hadn't crossed my mind because we were thinking about it in one context or another.
Yeah.
And then the individual in question is really into history and military history. And we just referenced, if you think back to some of those great military leaders that we look back on, almost all of them had a beard. What we've done is we've contextualized sort of things that belong to different eras and different places. And just by shaking it up a little bit, we might be able to view ourselves. The other one, I think we should finish with Perry, who's sitting right across from us here, because we've been debating the power of a college education. And when we're together in Savannah, I would love to talk to you about this because my eldest daughter would like to go to SCAD, which I may have to mortgage my soul to pay for her to go to design school in Savannah. But it came up where we were talking about the importance of having a college degree, whether we should hire for it. And then Ace and I forget, we were in a plane or a restaurant or somewhere, and neither of us had any recollection of what qualifications members of our team had. But we decided it was very important, then couldn't recall what qualifications anybody had. And I'm looking at Perry, one of our producers, and we didn't know whether you'd been in college, what you'd studied, all of those things, while saying it was very important at the same time. Yeah. So it's all in that realm of like, how do we attract more talent by breaking some of our frames around how we think about talent?
Indeed. So I would love if you jumped in on this question. This is all anonymous. You don't have to own any of this. But do you hold any biases that impede your ability to hire? We'll leave this open for a minute or two as you think about that and drop answers. And then what I'd love you to do is kind of through the lens of that same, how do we wrangle egos? And it's maybe not about ego, but about the individual, because everybody has ego. Would love to unpack maybe some of the biases we hold or that serve as barriers. And then you'll jump into breakout groups for about
Did we lose them, guys?
Yeah, it looks like we're having some technical difficulties. So if you guys could just bear with us for a little bit while we try to get them back on.
Hey, gang.
Where are we on? Are we on camera?
We are on camera.
Okay, there we go. So we had a camera drop out in the studio, but that's okay because Slido's up and you're answering questions. So I'll be back on in a second. And as you're answering, we'll kick you out to breakout groups here in a second. Let me get that camera back up.
Yep. And Madison, I heard you, I could see you speaking, but I didn't know what you were saying.
I don't know.
I was just letting everyone know that we were having some technical difficulties and we were going to get you guys back on as soon as possible.
You are so great. Thank you. And for what it's worth, you're on camera now because I'm plugged into the switcher. So can you hear them though?
Yes, they sound pretty good.
Sound good right now?
Lovely. Okay. V, can you read out some of the responses you see in Slido?
Sure. Seems like age is a frequent mention. Lots of job movement, job hopping, having too many jobs.
Had too many jobs, yeah.
Age, yeah.
Location. Okay.
I should say the age thing. I just want to own that because I'm the oldest in our firm, and I
Mhm.
still have I will talk about bringing new kids into the company,
Mhm.
literally, especially when I'm talking about tech, and that the evidence does not suggest that there's that relationship.
Yeah, job movement is a big one. Okay,
That's great.
great. So this is a good foundation. We're going to capture this and probably weave some of this into Savannah as well. But what I want to do is send you out to breakout groups. So you'll be in your respective groups. And from there, I'd love to some of these things with particular focus on the why. Like, why is age maybe an impediment, and what does that mean? Particularly breaking down some of those biases that you might hold as a leader, and how do we move forward to say, despite age, these might be things that folks bring to the table.
Oh,
There we go.
Can you say that again, please?
We will say that again. We're going to send you out to breakout groups. And what I'd love for you to do is talk through some of these biases. And as leaders, the discussion point might be, despite the bias that I hold, how might I look at some of the value folks bring to the table when they fit one of those demographic biases that I have? So for instance, around age, yeah, I have a bias there, but how might age be an asset to me? So you'll have about 15 minutes, maybe 20 in breakout groups. And then you will be able to jet from there. We won't pull you back together into a group. And we will see all of you in Savannah, which I'm really excited